Good morning, everyone. Happy Solar Eclipse Day. My name is Liz Braden, City Councillor for District 9, and I'm the Chair of the Boston City Council Committee on Housing and Community Development. Today is April 8th, 2024. This hearing is being recorded. It is also being live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. Written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.housing@boston.gov and will be made available as part of the record and available to all councillors. Most public testimony will be taken at the end of the hearing. The Chair will recognise a few attendees to testify at the start of the hearing to centre the voices of individuals most impacted by the topics of this morning's hearing. Individuals will be called on in the order in which they signed up and will have 2 minutes to testify. If you're interested in testifying in person, please add your name to the sheet near the entrance of the chamber. If you will testify virtually, please email our Central Staff Liaison, Ron Cobb, ron.cobb@boston.gov for the link, and your name will be added to the list. Today's hearing is on 2 dockets. Docket number 0202, Order for a Hearing on Addressing and Improving Fair Housing Practices in the City of Boston, and docket 0414, Order for a Hearing to Explore Programs the City of Boston offers or could establish to prevent illegal discrimination by landlords and real estate brokers against prospective tenants utilising housing choice vouchers. Docket 0202 was sponsored by Councillors Louis-Jean and Braden, myself, and referred to the committee on January 24th, 2024. Docket 0414 was sponsored by Councillors Santana, Weber, and Louis-Jean, and was referred to the committee on February 28th, 2024. Today I am joined by my colleagues in the order of arrival. Sponsor Councillor Louis-Jean, Councillor Santana, Councillor Weber, Councillor Durkin, and I also have a letter of apology from Councillor Coletta, which I will read into the record. Dear Chair Braden and Council colleagues, I regret to inform you that I will be absent from today's committee hearing on docket 0202, addressing improving fair housing practices in the City of Boston, and 0414, exploring programs the City of Boston offers or could establish to prevent illegal discrimination by landlords and real estate brokers against prospective tenants utilising housing choice vouchers. I am unfortunately under the weather, but my staff will be listening in and I will review the recording. Kindly read this letter into the record. Ensuring we are improving our fair housing practices across the city is essential, especially for our low-income community members in East Boston. I've also heard directly from many District 1 residents who have experienced voucher discrimination. It is imperative that we address these housing inequities for our residents, and I look forward to working with you to find effective solutions to these issues. Sincerely, Gabriella Coletta, Boston City Councillor, District 1. So this morning, we will open this hearing with public testimony centering voices of impacted residents. So we're going to be joined virtually by Miss Nikita Hayward, who's on Zoom, and she will speak to her experience, her lived experience as an impacted resident.
Good morning.
Good morning, Nikita. You have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nikita Hayward. I'm here to share my experience in the numerous occasions I've been a victim of racial and discrimination against voucher holders when looking for an apartment in Boston. I live in Dorchester and I'm a proud parent of 2 sons and 2 daughters who range in the age 26 to 11 years old. I'm also a proud graduate of the One Family Scholar Program, and in 2019 I graduated from Springfield College with a bachelor's degree in human services. Since January of 2022, I've worked in the emergency department at Boston Medical Center, where I conduct mental health crisis assessments and substance abuse assessments. My career goal is to become an addiction recovery counselor so that I can provide for my family while at the same time giving back to my community. Due to the housing discrimination that I experienced for a stretch of many years from 2001 and continuing until 2022, I found it extremely difficult to find housing in several Massachusetts communities. For many years, my family and I were forced to live in vermin-infested, run-down apartments in very unsafe neighborhoods in Boston. No family should ever have to endure what we went through. Some of the conditions that we were exposed to was community violence, infestation of roaches, mice, things like that. I kept a log documenting the discriminations that I faced when looking for a decent place to live for my family and I. For example, one real estate broker told me that my voice sounded very ethnic and scary and hung up on me. On many occasions, rental agents have informed me that they weren't interested in renting to voucher holders. On other occasions, as soon as I mentioned my voucher, I was told that I would need to have a credit score of at least 780 and told total move-in costs would be in the tens of thousands of dollars. Other times I've been able to view an apartment for rent. The broker's body language said what they wouldn't put into words. So I am not the type of tenant probably that they were looking for. I got to the point where I wondered if my family and I would ever find a decent place to live. It seemed like a miracle when we finally found the beautiful apartment in a nice part of Dorchester last year. And I thank God now we have a safe place to call home with plenty of room for all of us. My salary covers the lion's share of the monthly rent, but the voucher makes it a little more comfortable. But it took us far too long to reach this place in our lives, largely because of the housing discrimination that we experienced. And due to that discrimination, my children were repeatedly exposed to traumatic violence in the neighborhood, and we were forced to live within, and it continues to impact them to this very day. I urge the City Council to take steps to end housing discrimination. In particular, I urge members of the City Council to reach out to State Representative Adrian to offer support of legislation that has been filed and act to end housing discrimination in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Thank you very much, Nikita. Thank you for your testimony this morning. So this morning we have 2 panels. I'll just go over our invited panelists. Panel 1 for the administration is Mr. Robert Terrell, Executive Director of the Office of Fair Housing and Equity, Mr. Nick Kelly, Director of Innovation and Research at the Boston Housing Authority, Ms. Virginia Albert, Senior Civil Rights Advisor at the Boston Housing Authority. Our second panel is non-city organizations and advocates, Ms. Whitney Demetrius, Director of Fair Housing and Municipal Engagement at Citizens Housing and Planning Association, CHAPA, Mr. Jacob Love, Staff Attorney at Lawyers for Civil Rights, Ms. Kelly Vieira, pardon me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Director of Investigations and Outreach, Clinical Fellow on Housing Discrimination Testing Programme at Suffolk University Law School. We also will be have remote testimony from Ms. Ashley Grant, Director of Fair Housing Enforcement, Housing Discrimination Testing Programme at Suffolk University Law School. So with no further ado, I will ask my colleagues to make brief opening remarks. I will start with Council President Louis Jean.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. Happy Solar Eclipse Monday. I am grateful for everyone who's here. I'm grateful for the leadership of Bob Terrell in our Fair Housing Office and for all the advocates. I'm grateful for my colleague, Councilor Santana, for his focus on fair housing with respect to voucher discrimination. And I want to thank you, Nikita, for offering your testimony. Fair housing means that everyone should have the same chance to find a home, no matter what they look like, their income level, or where they come from. It's about making sure that all people are treated fairly when they're looking to rent or buy a home. We think that we celebrate the Fair Housing Act. That was no easy feat, and that Martin Luther King had championed. And last week we recognized his assassination on April 4th. And thinking about how that was really the catalyst for the Fair Housing Act, something so dire. And we continue to celebrate it, but also to miss the mark when it comes to enforcement. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel about what we can do in terms of internally at the city, but also partnering with our organizations. And when it comes to what we have direct control over on the city council, which is the budget, and seeing if we are adequately investing in the gold standard of paired testing, if we are investing sufficiently in education programs. And so I'm grateful for this conversation. I also want to uplift Carol Lasky in Fenway, who had me write about fair housing in the Fenway News. And I think that there's really great interest in how we're complying with fair housing in the city of Boston. So I'm just looking forward to this conversation. And I know that Lawyers for Civil Rights and so many others have a lot to share with us. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Luigi. And we've been also joined this morning by Councillor Fitzgerald, Councillor Tanya Fernandez-Anderson, Councillor Mejia. Got everybody. Thank you. Councillor Santana, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my co-sponsors on the hearing order I filed on housing choice voucher discrimination, Councillor Weber and Councillor President Nguyen. I also want to thank President Nguyen for your leadership on a separate hearing order on fair housing practices in Boston and for offering to partner for today's hearing to address these connected topics all at once. I'm grateful for Chair Breeden and Councillor Worrell for joining that matters as co-sponsors as well, and to all my colleagues for joining us today. It's truly an honor to serve on this body alongside so many other housing advocates. I want to reaffirm a fundamental truth. Housing is a human right. The most basic step of living up to that vision is preventing direct discrimination against people when they're renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, or seeking housing assistance. 56 years ago this week, the Federal Fair Housing Act established in law this most basic idea, that people should be able to pursue a place to live without regard to their race, color, national origin, sex, family status, religion, or disability. Not that anyone should have any special rights or access, just that the playing field should be level. And here in Boston, we're fortunate to have additional city and state laws in place, which extend protections against housing discrimination to include income source, including housing vouchers, as well as age, martial status, veteran or active military status, and genetic information. And our local laws also include explicit protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which is especially critical in this era when we see increasing legislative attacks against our LGBTQ+ community, particularly our trans, non-binary, and gender-expansive siblings, and when we've seen just how fragile our federal protections can be. But we know just having laws isn't enough. We have to enforce them too. Despite our laws, evidence continues to show that housing discrimination is a widespread problem, and we shouldn't accept that. Discrimination against housing choice voucher holders is particularly rampant. We know that from personal lived experience. My huge gratitude to Nakia Haywood for joining us today to share your story. And we know it from cases that the City of Fair Housing and Equity has worked on. And I'm grateful to have Director Bob Terrell here with us today. And we know it from data. In fact, a 2020 Suffolk Law study found discrimination in 86% of tests with housing providers in Greater Boston. We're fortunate to have with us today Director Kelly Riera, who has worked on Suffolk's law studies of housing discrimination in Boston, including performing over 200 tests. We know testing is an important part of the solution, and I'm excited to learn from your expertise. And discrimination hasn't stopped since 2020. We know this from testing from testing performed by the Housing Rights Initiative and a lawsuit filed by lawyers for civil rights just a few weeks ago against 20 Boston area landlords that HRI found evidence are discriminating. I'm honored to welcome attorney Jacob Love from LCR to our panel today. Housing choice vouchers are meant to allow people to choose a place to rent in any neighborhood, including ones that would often otherwise be unaffordable. Yet, we know discrimination makes it a struggle for voucher holders to find a home to rent in Boston, so renters don't get access to all neighborhoods. We know this from data too. A 2016 study of Boston Housing Authority data found that 76% of Boston area voucher recipients live in lower opportunity neighborhoods. I'm grateful to have Director of Innovation and Research Nick Kelly and Senior Civil Rights Advisor Virginia Albert from BHA here with us today on our panel. And I want to thank Director Whitney Demetrius for your work on fair housing with SHAPA in Boston and throughout Massachusetts, and for joining us today on our panel. We know that voucher discrimination is a critical issue to address because so many people rely on housing vouchers to help cover the affordability gap for our expensive rents in Boston. Over 90,000 households in Massachusetts benefit from the Federal Housing Choice Voucher Program. Most of these households are seniors, children, or people with disabilities. And 10,000 households receive rental assistance from the Massachusetts Voucher Program, which is actually the largest state-funded rental assistance program in the country. And here in Boston, we have a city-run voucher program as well. And rental assistance has been proven highly effective at ending family homelessness. A HUD study found families living in homeless shelters were twice as likely to remain in stable housing when provided a housing voucher, by comparison to other support like continued shelter, rapid rehousing, and transitional housing. Everyone deserves a home, and everyone deserves fair access when trying to find one. And we know that's not happening all the time. I look forward to today's discussion to see how we can continue to improve that throughout the work here together. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Santana. Councillor Weber?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Madam President, Lou Jen and Councillor Santana for bringing this. Discrimination based on housing vouchers is insidious. The people who need housing, we don't have enough affordable housing. We don't have enough BHA housing here in Boston, and the voucher program is designed to help people most in need. But as the Suffolk Law School study and the Lawyers for Civil Rights and Housing Rights Initiative action show, it's actually it's not just a once in a while occurrence. It's the standard here in Boston. Is that 86% of people who have vouchers experience discrimination in trying to find housing, and I'd highlight in the lawsuit filed by Lawyers for Civil Rights and Housing Rights Initiative that they did a random, they contacted landlords randomly. They didn't target, the worst practitioners. They looked at, real estate ads and reached out to people through text, and what they found was widespread discrimination against voucher holders. And so, it's something that we need to do everything we can to stamp out in our city and make sure that people who hold vouchers, can get the housing they need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Weber. Councillor Durkin, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much to Councillor Santana and Council President Ruth Jen for your focus on housing. This conversation couldn't be more important. Expanding the housing stock at all price points in Boston in all cities around Boston to meet the needs of affordable housing is essential. Our lack of affordable housing poses a threat to our region's prosperity. But what we realize is that it isn't just about supply. It's also an issue of access to the existing housing supply for those that are left behind with unfair practices that seek to deprioritize voucher holders and those in need of affordable subsidies. The entrenched discrimination of our housing practice requires close examination, especially 56 years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. We know that the source of income-based discrimination exists. We must address it, expose it, and combat it at every step to eliminate barriers to using vouchers and create parity and fairness in systems that have bred inequities. Let us center opportunity and justice in this conversation and in this fight, and look forward to seeing what we can do about eliminating credit checks and what we can do as city councilors in development and the Article 80 process to make sure that all developers and new built housing comply with what we want to see, which is that everyone can access housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Durkin. Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Council Santana, Lujan, Council Weber for bringing these forward. Here to learn a lot about what this is about, and I'm very interested to hear from the panels. It's certainly a concern that we have. Everybody deserves a right to fair housing, and if there's any discrimination of any kind, that's the lowest common denominator of future issues. So we just need to snuff this out at the beginning. So here to learn, here to look forward to it. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Fitzgerald. Councillor Fernandez-Anderson. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. Looking forward to this conversation. Obviously, lots of experience advocating for folks along, whether it be Section 8 or Metro Housing or Boston Housing, but on different levels. It's not just people with Section 8, but people, undocumented folks as well. Sometimes don't ask, don't tell policies is not necessarily adhered to. So just looking forward to understanding exactly where to go with this. As you guys know, I filed ordinance to actually implement some metrics against discrimination and to guarantee or to ensure better, fair housing, as well as last year filed as well on rental or real estate fees, and how that's also, folks are also discriminated against based on whether or not you have enough money to pay those real estate fees. So I think this conversation can expand to further than just discrimination around whether or not you have Section 8. Looking forward to bringing my point of views and hearing my colleagues as well as the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fernandez-Anderson. Councillor Mejia, you have the floor.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Thank you to the sponsors for hosting this hearing. I think, I always like to invoke the spirit of my previous colleague, Councillor Lara, who always talks about that the political is personal. And I think that as we continue to have these conversations, recognizing that, the lived experience of those who have been discriminated against oftentimes are displaced and no longer living here in the city of Boston. So all of these things are interconnected. And I also think that as we're talking about discrimination, I really want to also highlight that race is definitely a factor, but I also think that there's a targeted hit on people of low income status. So whether they're poor white, poor Black, poor Latino, I just think that poverty is under attack. And I think that when we're talking about discrimination, I think that there is a targeted impact on folks who are low income. And I think that discrimination, I just want to uplift because Section 8, everybody's getting rich off of it. To be honest with you, there are a lot of people who are homeowners here in the city of Boston that don't live here, but they own triple deckers, and they live outside of Massachusetts and sometimes out in the suburbs, but yet they are still discriminating against the very same people who they are trying to make a buck out of. So looking forward to talking about it and figuring out what we need to do to change that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia. We've been joined by Councillor Ed Flynn. Councillor Flynn, would you like to make some opening remarks?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, Madam Chair.
Oh, Councillor, we've also been joined by Councillor Erin Murphy. Councillor Murphy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Happy to be here to talk. We should always be looking at any city program, making sure that all of them are running properly, and if any of them are doing any illegal action that would be against residents and hindering them to have an opportunity to have a house and have a way to, support themselves. It's important that we level the playing field and make sure that there's no illegal discrimination to any residents or anyone coming into the city looking to live here. So happy for this conversation and continue advocating.
Thank you, Councillor Murphy. As the Chair of Housing, I really feel that our voucher programs across the many vouchers programs that we have represents our core values and our belief that housing is a human right. Housing choice vouchers are really an essential tool to open up access to housing in every neighbourhood of our city for those who cannot afford market rent. Rental assistance is critical to allowing families, elders and residents with disabilities to have stable, affordable housing in the city that they often grew up in or which they love. And it is one of our most, and this is one of the most expensive housing markets in the whole country. And without housing vouchers, so many folks would just not be able to afford to live and work in our city. Housing vouchers are not are an essential piece of the support that is offered to folks who are low income and middle income workers in the city who cannot afford full market rent. And I look forward to the conversation this morning. We really want to ensure that that there's fair housing practices being used in the administration of our voucher program, but also in their dealings with the real estate industry, landlords and brokers also. So I look forward to the conversation. And with that, I'd like to invite our panel. The non-city organisations and advocates panel will come first. Ms. Whitney Demetrius, Mr. Jacob Love and Ms. Kelly Vieira. No, don't take them two panels. Two panels? Is that the one? We also, if we have enough chairs, we'll invite the other panel down. We'll do the two panels. And, I think we'll have a really robust conversation this morning. So bringing everybody down at once might be a good idea. Mr. Robert Terrell from the administration, Mr. Robert Terrell, Mr. Nick Kelly, and Miss Virginia Albert. You come and have a seat as well. And if you, two people will have to share one mic here as we all squeeze in. I think we've got enough chairs. Yeah. Thank you all for being here this morning, bright and early on a Monday morning. I think the way we'll work it is just to give each one of you 5 minutes to speak to the particular issue. We will start with the advocates group, Ms. Whitney Demetrius, Mr. Jacob Love, and Miss Kelly. Am I pronounced, please?
It's Vieira. Vieira.
Vera.
Yes.
Okay, got it. I apologize for mispronouncing it. Ms. Demetrius, would you like to open we'll give everyone 5 minutes and then we'll go to Q&A.
Wonderful, thank you. Happy Fair Housing Month. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and City Council for the invitation to speak today. In light of Fair Housing Month, there is certainly an important conversation. My role as Director of Fair Housing and Municipal Engagement at CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, I get the opportunity to put fair housing at the forefront of all of our programmatic work as well as our policy initiatives. What I'm excited about, where I play different roles in my career as a testing coordinator, as an advocate, as hearing from calls like we heard the testimony today from Ms. Nikita, and hearing those stories, I now get the opportunity to begin to put some of the changes into practice and to policy change. And so that is sort of some of the role in what I'll be talking about today. At Chapel, we believe that everyone has the opportunity, and everyone should, to have a safe, healthy, and affordable and accessible home to live in, and that they should be able to make choices about where they want to live, free from housing discrimination. And so in doing that, we understand that fair housing is a protection for all, that everyone is a member of a protected class. And so our approach to the work really is centered in a lot of the work of my colleagues here on the panel. It has everything to do with great research and work that comes out from many of our experts, and the recommendations that come from that. And while I love a great report, what I also love to see is good work and change coming from it. So more recently, there has been a report directed by Dr. James Jennings that we at CHAPA got an opportunity to play a role in the research, called Advancing Fair Housing in Greater Boston, Massachusetts, Voices from the Field. He was partnered in his research with Ashley Harding, Katniss Paz, and Robert Terrell. And in the report, it highlights the need to first identify what affirmatively furthering fair housing actually is, and to ensure the need to amplify voices who are closest to the need. When thinking about affordable housing, when thinking about what it means to change different implications around fair housing. So I think that report is really crucial in thinking about how do we hear from folks to be able to think about what are the necessary remedies to address these things. There's also been a recent report by researcher Amy Dane called Exclusionary by Design that looked at race and class and family exclusion in Boston and the suburbs from the 1920s until today, and looking at how zoning has played an important and impactful role in how communities look today, and how class was used oftentimes as a veil to really thinking about how to keep races out of communities. So there's a lot of research, I think, that has come out more recently, and what I'm excited about is that CHAPA's priorities, all of our priorities, are fair housing priorities. What I'm excited to see is the State Office of Fair Housing and the Fair Housing Trust Fund that's included in the Governor's Bond Bill, which is going to be, I think, an opportunity to address a lot of these issues that we see not only in Greater Boston, but for the entire state. Having a state office of fair housing will allow for there to be an appointed body that looks and pays close attention to what it means to address activities to eliminate housing discrimination and to affirmatively further fair housing across the state, in addition to a Fair Housing Trust Fund. That Fair Housing Trust Fund will allow for money, and as I think was already mentioned here today, we understand that a budget is a moral document, and where we put our money and our resources and our time is important in terms of how we address fair housing issues. And so I think some of what can come out of that Fair Housing Trust Fund is to be able to fund more reports from the Suffolk Law's Housing Discrimination Testing Program, be able to support the City of Boston's Fair Housing Commission, be able to do special projects around exclusionary zoning. It could be a place where all of the research around fair housing can be housed. It is a place where we can fund organizations to do appraisal testing, which I think is so crucial and important in a time like this, not just thinking about discrimination as it relates to rent and mortgage and lending and insurance and sales, but also appraisal. So thinking about it from an entire spectrum of the housing market. The State Office of Fair Housing has so much potential to really be able to put fair housing at the forefront of all of the issues and to do education and outreach, not only so that people know what their rights are, but also so that housing providers do not violate the law as well. So there's so much to be done, I think, under the State Office of Fair Housing and the Fair Housing Trust Fund that I think we should pay close attention to. While at CHAPA, we also are constantly putting people first at the before all of our work as we think about production and planning and preservation. Again, as I mentioned, all of our policies are fair housing policies. So thinking about eviction record sealing and access to counsel and eviction, match savings programs, zoning reforms, prohibiting exclusionary zoning, zero carbon renovation funds, Massachusetts Healthy Homes Program, all of these different things together collectively are fair housing issues. So I'm thankful to be able to be here today to speak on these issues and open to any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Love, would you like to you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jacob Love, and I'm a staff attorney at Lawyers for Civil Rights, a nonprofit legal advocacy organization in Boston. First, I'd like to say thank you to Councilor Braden and this committee for having me here today. Boston's ongoing affordable housing crisis, as everyone here likely knows, is the city's most pressing public health and civil rights issue. Not only is our housing supply woefully insufficient to meet demand, driving up prices to stratospheric heights, but the knock-on harms are felt most acutely in Boston's low-income households and communities of color. Families are being forced out of neighborhoods where they've lived for generations by ever-rising costs, and those that have managed to stay put often have to sacrifice on other necessities, like food, medication, and utilities, just to make their rent payments each month. On top of that, our state's homeless shelters are overwhelmed by families with children who have fallen victim to the endless financial pressures that such a merciless housing market puts on people. Solving these problems will no doubt take all the time and attention this body can spare in the coming years. But sadly, I'm here to talk about an even more disturbing issue in Boston's residential space, and that's the rampant, shameless discrimination that housing providers are subjecting low-income Bostonians to throughout the city. For much of the last year, LCR's client, the Housing Rights Initiative, investigated landlord and real estate broker practices regarding subsidized housing vouchers, commonly known as Section 8 vouchers. Building on a long history of civil rights testing practices, they had testers pose as voucher holders and inquire about private apartment listings. Over and over, landlords and brokers responded positively to tester outreach until the moment the testers asked if they would be able to use their housing vouchers on rent. At that point, the housing providers either ghosted the testers entirely, or even worse, openly told the testers that they would not accept vouchers. Massachusetts law explicitly forbids this kind of discrimination. That's why in February, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of HRI against 20 Boston area landlords and real estate brokers, seeking to hold them accountable for these kinds of practices. The complaint includes scores of damning text message screenshots demonstrating the brazenness with which this happens. Housing vouchers are designed to help low-income families secure quality housing in their preferred neighborhood by subsidizing a portion of the rent. In the midst of the affordable housing crisis, vouchers are often the only way that thousands of families can get and keep a roof over their heads. Widespread voucher discrimination impedes the housing search process, prolonging the time that voucher-approved families must spend in homeless shelters, on the streets, or in substandard dwellings. This destabilizes and endangers families and children. It also entrenches Boston's racially segregated housing patterns. Bostonians of color are overwhelmingly concentrated in low-income areas with fewer public resources than similarly situated white families. Voucher discrimination perpetuates this reality by limiting the options available to voucher holders outside of those areas. For many years, anti-discrimination laws just haven't been enough to deter housing providers from acting illegally. Voucher holders frequently don't have the time or resources to report illegal practices, let alone to sue landlords who engage in them. So despite how widespread voucher discrimination is in Boston, it almost always goes unpunished. That has to stop. State and municipal governments have it within their power to enforce anti-discrimination laws. The U.S. Department of Justice has a dedicated fair housing testing program, and there's no reason why that program can't be replicated at the local level. The Boston City Council can and should invest its resources in preventing voucher discrimination, either by creating a testing program or through some other means. And I close now by calling on this body to start that critical process today. Thanks very much for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Love. Ms. Vera, I understand you have a presentation you'd like to share with us on that.
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the council. I do have some slides today as I'll be citing some figures from our research studies, and I'll be going through those as I speak today. Thank you so much to the chair and to the council for invitation for us to testify today. And I'd also like to thank you for holding this hearing, which addresses the critical issue of housing discrimination, especially during, as my colleague Whitney mentioned, during Fair Housing Month in April. My name is Kelly Vieira. I'm an attorney, a test coordinator, and a Boston resident. I'm also the Director of Investigations and Outreach at Suffolk University Law School's Housing Discrimination Testing Program, which I'll call HGTP for short. The The HDTP is a full-service fair housing nonprofit which engages in housing discrimination testing, education and outreach, enforcement, curriculum development, and academic studies. Since 2012, HDTP has conducted over 1,000 discrimination tests, published empirical research studies, brought thousands of dollars of damages to victims of discrimination, and we've educated thousands of people about their fair housing rights and responsibilities. The HDTP is housed right in the heart of Boston. In fact, it's right down the street at Suffolk University Law School. From its inception over a decade ago, the HDTP has served the city of Boston and its surrounding communities. 13 years ago, Victoria Williams, then director of the City of Boston's Office of Fair Housing and Equity, approached HDTP's academic director, Professor Bill Berman, who at the time was running the Housing Law Clinic at Suffolk. She asked if it was possible to create a housing discrimination testing program. It was a lofty endeavor, but it was one that Professor Berman decided to take on. When funding became available soon after, the program was started from scratch with the intention of investigating the issue of housing discrimination in Boston. During that time, Professor Berman brought on attorney Jamie Langowski, who's now the program's administrative director, to help with running discrimination tests across the city to great success. In the years since, HDTP has expanded in many ways, but the majority of our testing remains focused on the Boston metro area, which is our home base. I'll very briefly describe what testing is for anyone who's unfamiliar. The best way to describe it is that it's very similar to secret shopping. Instead of sending shoppers to retail stores, we send our volunteers, who we call testers, who are trained to pose as prospective renters and inquire about housing. Testing is an investigative tool that's crucial in the fight for fair housing. Often, housing discrimination can manifest in very subtle ways, and it can be very difficult to prove. An individual may feel strongly that they were discriminated against, but remain unsure on how to prove their case in court. That's where testing comes in. Through testing, we're able to carefully compare how our testers are treated and document the typical business practices of owners, landlords, real estate professionals, brokers, and property managers. Far too often, like Attorney Love just described moments ago, testing reveals that the mere mention of a housing voucher can lead to discrimination in the form of ghosting, not being offered tours, or even, as Attorney Love mentioned, explicit statements denying housing just because someone will be using a housing voucher. Voucher holders are one of the protected classes most likely to hear explicit, straightforward discriminatory statements, whether that be from the housing provider's ignorance of the law or simple unwillingness to abide by it. In 2020, through the support of the Boston Foundation, HDTP released an empirical study called Qualified Renters Need Not Apply, which I'll be referencing in my slides. That study comprised of extensive testing in the Boston metro area from 2018 to 2019, and it found disturbingly high levels of discrimination, both against Black prospective renters and voucher holders. The statistics, which are verified through HDTP's partnership with one of the largest economic consulting firms, the Analysis Group, showed even higher levels of discrimination than initially expected. So the way that we designed this study is through what is called paired testing, where we were sent out testers who were given very similar profiles. They were all equally qualified to rent. They all could afford the apartments that we were investigating, including the voucher holders. We controlled for all elements except for whether they had a voucher holder and their race. So you see on the screens here, we trained 200 individual testers for this study, 100 white testers and 100 Black testers, and then we split those two pools based on market rate and who would be representing that they had a voucher. And we sent 4 testers, one from each category, to each individual apartment. And this is just a bit more about paired testing, but essentially what we did was control for everything, so they would have the same type of credit, the same rental history, they would have very similar jobs, they could all afford the apartment, whether they were market rate or using a voucher, and they would be similar in all other ways, like all the testers would be single, or all of them would be the same sex for the purposes of the test. And what we found is that a staggering 86% of our testers who represented they had a voucher were discriminated against in this study. And additionally, 71% of our Black testers experienced discrimination, whether they said they had a voucher or not. Despite these properties being completely randomly selected, testing still uncovered this pattern of rampant discrimination across the board in the Boston area. Looking closer at this data, we see that HGTP's research reflects what we know through anecdotes, including what Ms. Haywood talked about this morning in terms of lived experience. Housing discrimination is commonly subtle, taking the form of what the study calls discrimination with a smile. Although housing providers were usually polite to our testers, they still experienced discrimination. For example, ghosting was a consistent issue. Testers might be promised that they would get a call back, only to never hear from the housing provider again once they mentioned the voucher. In our study, housing providers ghosted 40%, or ghosted our voucher testers 40% of the time, or over 40% of the time. And this is a chart kind of talking about the statistical analysis here. What we found is that even when housing providers told voucher holders that their voucher was not a problem, they would still discriminate against those testers 81% of the time. Our research also just demonstrated that if you are someone who has a voucher, to actually tour 10 units, you would need to call around 50. Imagine the time it takes to inquire and call 50 apartments. Now imagine how much more stressful that would be if you only had a few months to find an apartment, because if you take too long, you will lose your voucher, a voucher that people sometimes wait a decade for. The HGTP has represented clients who were at risk of losing housing altogether, solely because they were being discriminated against so often while looking for an apartment while they had a voucher. This is another chart from our study. It's just showing the disparities in how often testers would get to tour an apartment. Essentially, you had the most likely chance to tour an apartment if you were a white tester without a voucher. If you had a voucher regardless of your race, your chance of seeing the unit goes way down, as you can see by the colored bars, which are much smaller. I will move on to another study or another project that we did. The stats in our study make it clear. If you're a prospective renter who has a housing voucher, or you're a prospective Black renter, you are much more likely to be discriminated against than to be treated fairly. This cannot be accepted as a norm. Discrimination harms the most vulnerable members of our community, and in fact, it harms the entire community at large, and it has to be addressed proactively. After our study was released, we are proud to say that proactive change did happen. After seeing our study, the City of Boston's Office of Fair Housing and Equity approached HGTP and asked us to start a brand new testing project focused on the City of Boston. The city partnered with HGTP and provided funding to hire a full-time test coordinator who would do extensive testing in Boston with a special focus on race and source of income. I was that test coordinator who was hired in 2020, and I joined in November of that year. Over the next 15 months, I performed 100 discrimination tests in the City of Boston, covering every neighborhood in Boston. As more funding became available, the next year the project was renewed, and one of my colleagues who I oversaw conducted 80 more tests in the City of Boston. Our partnership led to real outcomes. In just the first 15 months of the project, over $66,000, or at least $66,000 in settlements were achieved as a direct result of test evidence, meaning that there was no complainant. It was just test evidence that found discrimination. The city filed agency-initiated complaints, and the housing providers were brought to account. If that testing had not happened, it's possible that those housing providers never would have been held accountable for their illegal discriminatory acts. I owe a lot of my success in the project of being a Boston resident myself. I've lived in the greater Boston area for over a decade, and I've lived in 3 different Boston neighborhoods. I currently live in Dorchester. I guess you could call me an honorary Bostonian, I've become very familiar with the different parts of Boston, the personality of different areas, the socioeconomic demographics of different neighborhoods, and that was a huge benefit because I could design tests that were focused on what might be problematic about different parts of Boston. And unfortunately, what we found during that testing effort in Boston is, again, high levels of discrimination. In the 100 tests that I did between January 2021 and February 2022, we found evidence of discrimination 46% of the time, so almost half. Narrowing it down to just tests that focused on housing related to voucher holders, 47.5% of those tests discovered evidence of discrimination. And during that second year of the project, we also saw significant levels of discrimination. Testing is one of the many ways that we can fight towards more equitable housing access. In the city's exploration of potentially expanding fair housing efforts, we encourage the council to consider the immeasurable value of test evidence, the impact it can have on both individuals who experience discrimination and the community at large. In fact, my colleague Ashley Brandt will testify later to the individual impacts it can have on people who are suffering from discrimination. Should the funding become available, the HGTP is a fully running testing program that has lots of experience doing this type of work. We're fortunate to have a very large tester pool. We have over 100 testers active at any given time, most of them calling the Boston area their home. And we are continually expanding our tester pool with year-round recruitment efforts. Because our tester pool is so wide and so large, we do have the opportunity to test across protected categories. And with our current pool and our team of test coordinators, we have the capacity to start a new testing program immediately if the opportunity arose. So again, I thank the council for the opportunity to testify and to talk about what we've uncovered in terms of housing discrimination. And I'm thankful for the City of Boston's continued commitment for serving its residents and ensuring fair housing for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all your work, and thank you for your very comprehensive explanation of your testing program. I think we'll just keep going with the panel, and then we'll have our Q&A at the, because I think there's a lot of intersectionality across the conversation. Mr. Terrell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to you and members of the committee. First of all, let me compliment the members of the City Council. It's not often when we have a hearing of this type and 11 out of 13 members of the City Council are present. And I think that's very significant given the fact that this is the first week of Fair Housing Month, a time when we honor those who gave their lives for the rights we enjoy. It's also a time for us to recommit ourselves to the very difficult work that lies ahead. The Boston Fair Housing Commission was established in 1982. Councilor Anderson, you'd be glad to know that it was your predecessor, City Councilor Bruce Bowling, that wrote our ordinance. And we live up to that ordinance every day. The Fair Housing Commission is based on 5 major areas of work. One, and most importantly, is enforcement and investigations. That is where we review complaints, and if we find the complaint has merit, we're authorized to take sanctions against those who have broken the law. Oftentimes when we do fair housing trainings, we have to remind people that housing discrimination is not just a mere inconvenience that causes a great deal of stress and trauma. It is illegal. They are breaking the law, and they're injuring people. So investigations and enforcement is the pillar that drives everything in our commission. Secondly is education and outreach. It is essential that people throughout the city of Boston know and understand what their rights and protections are. We know from numerous studies in the past that for every complaint we get, 7 people did not come forward. So we are beefing up our education and outreach work. We just hired someone to manage that part of our operation. In her first 6 weeks, she's already attended or organized 7 outreach and education events, the purpose of which is to find those 7 people and have them come and file a complaint with us. And I can tell you, Councilor Santana, that given your interest specifically in Section 8 voucher holders, we're not seeing enough complaints. We need people to come forward. Parallel to that, we're also initiating a public relations campaign to raise the profile of the commission so that people know who we are, where to find us, and where to file a complaint. So counselors, if you get a constituent that comes to you and you believe that it is a fair housing situation, please refer them to us immediately. Under our ordinance, they have 180 days to file a complaint from the time of the infraction. We will be back to the council at some time in the near future, asking you to help us amend our ordinance so we can make it 365 days, which would be equivalent to what MCAD and HUD offer people that come to them. Public policy is another important part of our work. One of the previous speakers mentioned legislation to create a state office of housing and a fair housing trust fund. We are supporting that effort because it's important for the state of Massachusetts to start making a contribution to supporting our fair housing infrastructure throughout the Commonwealth. Probably the most important policy work we're doing is on the assessment of fair housing, which I and other advocates worked on for 7 years before Mayor Wu signed the executive order that implemented the assessment. We are now working with all those city departments to make sure that they're living up to the goals and objectives that have been laid out for them in the assessment. Our next meeting will be April 29th, and we look forward to that continuing dialogue with them. We also hope to reestablish something. Here I'm dating myself. This is my second go-round with the commission, but many years ago, the commission itself had its own fair housing testing program. We hope to bring that back. The excellent work that you heard previously is what we refer to as systemic testing. We want to initiate internal testing program for complaint-driven testing. So as a complainant comes through the door, we can immediately send out testers to see what we find. It's a very effective way of supporting our investigatory work. And last but not least, litigation. There are times when we have to enforce our ordinance by going into court, either for a temporary restraining order, for a subpoena to solicit records and information from respondents. I hope in the course of this hearing we can get into further details about our work. The 2 dockets that are before you today posed 8 specific areas of concern. I spent the weekend going through those 8 areas of concern, and are prepared to answer some of the questions that those dockets raise. But I also want to say something else by way of context. We are truly living in dangerous times. There is a movement in this country that not only wants to dismantle democracy, but wants to take us back to the 19th century. They want to go back to the days of Plessy versus Ferguson. They want to go back to where we were before all the great civil rights bills were passed. They want to go back before Stonewall. And they want to take away a woman's right to choose. They want to take away our voting rights. They want to stop us from attending institutions of higher learning. I don't know whether this hearing, in terms of the broadcast media, who might be listening, but if they are listening, I have a message for them. we're not going back. We will never go back. We've come too far, as people in my community would say, we've come this far by faith, and we're not going back. I would submit to this council that the best way to defend democracy is to expand it, to be even more inclusive, more creative, and yes, more aggressive in every opportunity we have to expand democracy. So as we do this work today and in the future, to guarantee that every person in the city of Boston has a right to live wherever they wish, despite who they are, where they're from, what language they speak, what God they pray to. We should also keep in mind that this work is part of a much larger historic moment. And I hope we meet the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Terrell. Nick Kelly, Director of Innovation Research at BHA, you have the floor.
Thanks so much for having the Boston Housing Authority here today. My name is Nicholas Kelly. I'm the Director of Innovation and Research at the Boston Housing Authority. And in my role, I largely oversee our programs to increase economic opportunity for our residents. I'm also a researcher on fair housing issues, specifically investigating how to increase choice in the housing voucher program. So while the BHA is best known for its public housing developments, today twice as many families use the Housing Choice Voucher program. Currently, BHA has about 16,000 voucher households compared to a little over 8,000 households in our public housing. Households with vouchers tend to be very low income, and those incomes make it virtually impossible to live in Boston without some type of assistance. That's why for many families, receiving a voucher can be a golden ticket, enabling them to pay a humane amount of rent in an increasingly unaffordable city. However, despite the promise of housing choice vouchers, for many families, there's often little choice in the program at all. Families using vouchers have faced a number of barriers in using them, including bureaucratic inefficiency and unaffordable rents. At BHA, we've taken significant strides to fix these, including moving inspections to a biennial basis, implementing a modern customer service team, and adjusting rents to match zip code level markets. In addition, our housing search and landlord team has done extensive work building relationships with landlords and holds regular info sessions to increase landlord participation in the program. But despite these efforts, discrimination against voucher holders remains rampant. The Suffolk University study, already outlined here, demonstrated how landlords and brokers systematically discriminate against voucher holders and black renters. That's why, although BHA is not party to the lawsuit, we were happy to provide introductions for Housing Rights Initiative to work in Boston and Greater Boston, and why their lawsuit with Lawyers for Civil Rights is so important. Their work has exposed yet again that voucher holders face rampant discrimination in Boston, discrimination that is illegal under state law. In addition to being illegal, voucher discrimination is also misguided, ironic, and tragic. It's misguided because landlords often discriminate based on the myth that voucher inspection requirements are significantly more strenuous than units in the rest of the market, a myth that is not true given that the city has increased requirements for market rate units for inspections. It's ironic because voucher holders are more reliable rent payers. That's because their rent is backed by the federal government. So even if a family loses income, they can continue to pay the rent. And tragic, given voucher holder discrimination negatively impacts some of Boston's most vulnerable residents, many of whom are coming out of shelter. Indeed, discrimination can sometimes prevent households from finding a home at all. About 1 out of every 4 households with BHA never finds an apartment with their voucher, even after a full year of searching. Imagine finally receiving a voucher after living years in a shelter, only to be rejected simply because of the way you'll pay the rent. It's heartbreaking. That high rate of failure, which is actually lower than the national average, speaks to how rampant discrimination is and why we must do better. That's why we hope that this lawsuit will raise awareness that if landlords and brokers blatantly violate the law, they will face consequences. We welcome the opportunity to work with the council on new policies to reduce voucher discrimination. First, this lawsuit shows the dire need for enhanced enforcement to prevent discrimination against voucher holders. We simply do not have robust enough enforcement to make the risk of getting caught high enough to change landlord or broker behavior. Second, BHA supports banning broker fees, the prevalence of which put our voucher holders at a severe disadvantage compared to other buyers by disincentivizing brokers from working with our clients. These broker fees are just simply unaffordable for most people, let alone voucher holders. To conclude, we want to thank the council for calling this hearing and dedicating time to this important issue. We hope that this lawsuit will spur policymaking and innovation at the city to address voucher discrimination, and the BHA is excited to work with the council and the city to make it a thing of the past. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Ms. Virginia Albert, you have the floor.
Good morning, members of the council. Just to clarify the record, my name is Virginia Albert.
Oh,
sorry,
beg your
thank
pardon.
you. I'm an attorney. I'm the Senior Civil Rights Advisor at Boston Housing Authority's Office of Civil Rights. In my role, I do investigation for housing and employment discrimination cases that come through our office from BHA residents, applicants, employees, and visitors to our developments. I also lead the agency's internal Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing initiative. And my comments will provide context and insight into what BHA is doing regarding AFFH and why. I will start with the why. As a housing agency, we receive federal funding from HUD, and obviously we have the obligation to take action to undo historic segregation patterns and address other types of discrimination. That obligation comes from the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and so HUD issues regulation to guide the agency's implementation. We also get steered by whatever the regulation dictates. More recently, BHA also has reporting requirement for AFFH to the City of Boston after the Mayor Wu's January 2022 executive order on AFFH. And so that also influences the approach that BHA takes when it comes to our AFFH work. I'd like to offer an outline of a timeline that really sort of informs the work. So before 2015, HUD's requirement was not robust. At the time, it was just asking for analysis of impediment, and that was mostly requiring a plan to take action. And there weren't any record-keeping requirements and no reporting structure. Then we come to 2015. So in 2015, HUD released a new final rule on AFFH requiring the development of an assessment of fair housing. And that required an analysis of fair housing goals, data, also to set priorities and to identify contributing factors to housing and all the and the barriers facing housing. So in 2016, City of Boston began creating an assessment with the help of the Community Advisory Committee, CAC for short, and they did extensive community outreach. So from 2018 to 2020, we saw many changes at HUD. And so unfortunately, the 2015 rule was rescinded, and that was rescinded with the 2020 Preserving Communities rules that did not require any fair housing planning other than to certify compliance. So that brings us to 2020. The City of Boston decided to continue working on the assessment. The CAC continued putting together their draft of the assessment, and it outlined 14 broad goals and over 100 particular action steps within those goals. In 2021, HUD then released an interim AFFH rule that continued the certification requirement. It rescinded the 2020 rule, and it was more of a voluntary compliance structure. But in 2022, Mayor Michelle Wu signed an executive order on AFFH based on the work of the CAC and the draft assessment. And so that executive order established a monitoring committee that reviews fair housing goals and progress. In 2023, HUD published the most recent final rule on AFFH, And that rule brings us back closer to 2015 on the assessment of fair housing, which brings us back to a reporting structure and a focus on data. With the timeline, the importance of why I share it is to outline the sense of urgency that internally generated BHA's work. That is the certain sense of urgency that I inherited. My predecessor, Bob Terrell, was actively involved in the CAC, and so he had intimate knowledge of all the work that they were doing. And so in 2022, Boston Housing established the AFFH working group that I now lead. With our work, the task is to ensure that BHA is taking meaningful and actionable steps to advance the 22 out of the 100 particular goals that were assigned to BHA and the city's assessment. And so, when HUD's new final rule goes into effect, that will also influence our work. But right now, the city's goal is really driving the work that we are doing currently. Now for the what. So with the group, the internal group, we meet regularly, and our task is to sit, unpack all of the goals that were assigned to us. And so we identify actionable goals and identify feasible timeline, and we provide updates as to the progress of what we're doing. And one of those particular goals was Action 4.9, and Action 4.9 referenced the 2020 Suffolk University testing study, which was already mentioned here. And the goal also referenced the October 2020 hearing that the council held on AFFH. And so at the time, our former administrator, Kate Bennett, testified in front of the council, as well as former director of OCR, Christy Doyle, and then also Bob Terrell also testified to the council. And they spoke about the challenges that our voucher holders are facing when it comes to housing discrimination in the city of Boston and the greater Boston area. So when Action 4.9 was assigned to BHA, we were intimately aware of the state of the housing discrimination that our residents are facing. It was not a novel issue to us. And so the working group, obviously, BHA does not have the ability to take legal enforcement action, but we identified that we had the opportunity to partner. And so in 2022, BHA was happy to do the introduction to the Housing Rights Initiative to Boston in 2022. And so we applaud the lawsuit brought by LCR and HFA's partnership, as it identifies the bad actors that blatantly discriminated against voucher holders. And obviously, as my colleague already mentioned, BHA administers about 16,000 vouchers, and the housing discrimination that is so pervasive in the city of Boston really hinders our ability to assist in housing residents in the Boston area. And so I thank the council members for your time. I'm happy to take any questions on BHA's AFFH working group, our approach to the work and the goals that we are tackling every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your testimony. We're going to open it. I just want to acknowledge that Councillor Worrell has joined us from District 4. So I'll open up for Q&A. Councillor Louis-Jean, would you like to start? You've got 2 minutes. And then we'll keep it moving, and we'll try and come round for a second round if we can. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Chair Braden, and I want to just thank this esteemed panel for just all of the incredible insight on enforcement, on testing, on the groups that are most discriminated against, and sort of the work that is necessary to invest, and also Director Terrell for the calling and the pointing out that, ever forward is the only way. My colleagues and I are hearing on a resolution that I sponsor with Councilor Santana recognized April as Fair Housing Month. And I remember, Ms. Demetrius, when we had a panel 2 years ago, you bringing that to our attention. And so I want to thank you for being back in this chamber. I want to also thank you for something that I've talked to Director Terrell about, but you also said about, testing, because I think on that panel that I had you on, it was really about discrimination in lending and appraisals. And we talked about how we can be doing testing not only in the realm of renting, but also in ownership. And we know that that contributes to the racial wealth gap. We know that it contributes to displacement. And so I really appreciated you elevating that. And so, Director Terrell, you spoke to it. The two things that I care most about are paired testing and education awareness campaign. And the way that we can do that on the council is via the budget. We've invested, gratefully in more support for your office, and we fought for more funding these last 2 years so that you could do internally the testing that you talked about. Would love to see that happen. And you talked about how there's now a new staff, and we're happy that we were able to support that. Will help with that, has been attending education events. What would a robust education, and this is for you and for the entire panel, what would a robust education awareness campaign look like? Would it be at RT stations? Would it be at our bus stops? What would it really look like? Would it be digital? And I think the answer you all will say is both, but will it be targeted towards applicants, right? Those who are themselves are victims of discrimination, or towards those leasing and renting or selling property?
It takes several different forms. One, we get a lot of requests from organizations, institutions throughout the city of Boston to come and do fair housing trainings for their organization. The most recent one was for the Greater Boston Real Estate Board. They usually check in with us once or twice a year and ask us to come out and train their members. So those are sort of catch as catch can. As the requests come in, we honor the requests. But we want to be, in the next year or so, more proactive. We want to start setting up fair housing trainings in all of our public libraries and advertise them to folks in the neighborhood so they can come and get all their fair housing questions answered. Our hope in doing that, again, as I stated, is to get more people to come forward and file complaints. And by the way, when we say file complaints, an individual person can file a complaint on their own behalf, or you can file a complaint if you know of a fair housing situation. You may not be directly involved, but if you know of such a situation, you can file the complaint. Also, with regard to the power of systemic testing, if we were to look at those test results and we had access to them, we as a commission can bring our own complaint. We don't have to wait for an individual person to walk through the door. We can bring our own complaint. And that's something that we derive from our federal statute. Along with the education and outreach activities, we're going to be ramping up, as I said earlier, a public relations campaign. So very soon you're going to be seeing a lot of Boston Fair Housing Commission presence on social media. We're going to be doing interviews with folks and posting those videos on our website. Watch out, counselors, we may be knocking on your door for an interview. We'll make you all famous. So we're instituting these new activities to raise the profile of the commission and to encourage people to come forward with information they have about discrimination occurrences.
Thank you. Councillor Santana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Let's start the clock. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I have to give you the mic. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I know a while back, and thank you for our panelists again for being here. I know a while back Suffolk Law did one of the first studies, or maybe even the very first study of the housing discrimination suffered by people based on gender identity and expression. For any of the panelists, are you aware of recent data for Boston on housing discrimination on the basis of gender identity and expression, particularly for our members of our trans community?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry. Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers from that study on hand today. I apologize. I should have brought that along. But I will say, in terms of what that study uncovered, the pattern that we saw in that study involving transgender and gender nonconforming testers. The way that we designed it is that we sent cis or non-transgender testers and then testers who are trans or gender nonconforming. We sent them out to inquire about apartments, and what we saw were high levels of discrimination. But the way the discrimination manifested was, I think, specific to that community. For example, what we saw was that those transgender testers or gender nonconforming testers experienced things like being less likely to be asked their name. Something as simple as that. They would show up to the tour, no, how are you, what's your name, remind me your name, none of that, where we saw that happening with our cis or non-trans testers. We also saw that our trans testers were more likely to be told negative comments about the unit. For example, the neighborhood or the unit itself would be framed negatively, whereas the housing provider would frame it as a positive to the cis testers, basically trying to sell it to them more. We also saw that trans testers were less likely to, and I'm so sorry I don't have the statistics offhand, but less likely to be given rent incentives. For example, being offered, if you apply by this date, you'll get a free month, or I'll waive the security deposit, or things like that. And we were able to uncover that through using testers who were actually trans, who were perceived as trans, whether it be because of their voice or their name on their ID not matching the name that they use, things like that. So we were able to ensure that it was the fact that our testers were trans or gender nonconforming that was causing these disparities in treatment. And while we haven't released an updated version of that study, at least in the testing that happens nationally related to that issue, it seems like it still remains that these patterns are happening.
Very good, thank you. Next, Councillor Weber, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I guess, Director Terrell, so in terms of complaints, do you have numbers on, how many complaints your office receives? How many complaints do we have to turn away people? What kind of staffing do you think you need to be able to handle the demand?
Last fiscal year, we had 120 intakes. That resulted in us carrying out 74 investigations, 62 of which were federal, 12 were state protected class. I'm glad to report to the council that in terms of Region 1 under HUD, we're the most productive FAP agency in New England. We actually closed more investigations than anybody else in the region. Those then move on in the process to either settlements. Oftentimes the parties will choose to settle the case. On a rare occasion, they may ask for an appeal, which we grant. And then finally, it goes to what we call an administrative hearing, because our process is quasi-judicial. It's an administrative process where a commissioner hears the case, and as the facts of the case come forward, our commissioner is asked to use the Massachusetts Rules of Evidence to figure out what information is really pertinent. And then based on that, our commissioner will make a recommendation to the full commission, and then they vote. They may remand it back to the commissioner for further review. They may amend the commissioner's recommendation, or they may pass it as is. When an order is issued by our commission, it usually has 3 elements that are part of it: compensatory damages for the complainant, which may also include the coverage of their legal fees. A civil penalty may be imposed, and that's an issue we really need to discuss, is the disposition of civil penalties. And we always require fair housing training for all the respondents. So if it's a real estate broker's office, we not only ask that the immediate people that were a party to the case be trained, we want the entire staff trained. They can do the training with us, they can do it with HUD, they can do it with MCAD, but they have to check back in with us so we know that the training took place.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll keep going. Your time is up.
Short time period.
Councillor Fitzgerald, Councillor Durkin. Councillor Fernandez-Anderson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is to anyone on the panel, really. When you're thinking about all of these issues with discriminatory practices, what proactive measures do you think here on the council, considering the budget, considering that I understand that, Mr. Terrell, you've already gone through the process of making your budget recommendation to the mayor, but we are at an opportune moment. Budget is upon us next week, or this week. Is it this week? And in terms of whether it be more funding or resources, proactive measures that can be implemented in order for us to work on this. Please.
I'm happy to speak to that. Of course, I spoke a lot about testing, and I do want to emphasize again really it's hard to measure how valuable testing is because it allows us to create a record of something that often goes hidden. Very often, those 7 people that Bob mentioned in terms of that don't report, it can be for a lot of reasons, but sometimes they don't report because they don't think that it's enough that they can actually prove that it happened to them. It was just a tone that someone took, or someone ghosted them, but they don't really know why, but it did happen right after they mentioned a voucher. It's things like that where they're not sure, can I even prove that this happened to me? It's just my word against the landlord. But testing removes that because we can investigate and say, we sent out testers, and during that investigation, we saw a pattern where they were being treated unfairly based on their protected class. So more testing, I think, always is helpful because it creates that evidence that you might not otherwise have. Just to touch a bit on the previous question about outreach and education. So my dual role is that I'm director of outreach and also investigations. So on the outreach side, HETP is part of a coalition called the Fair Housing Alliance of Massachusetts, or FAM, where 4 different fair housing nonprofits have come together specifically to focus on the issue of voucher discrimination. So for the past year, we've been working together to do what is beginning to be a very large outreach campaign specifically for voucher holders, where we're going to be doing things like having ads on the MBTA, which you've already had some experience doing that, doing outreach in terms of reaching out to housing authorities, to landlords, to residents themselves. I can speak to my own experience as director of outreach at HETP. Last year, I personally trained over 800 people. So you can only imagine, I am just one person, right? So if we have more funding and can hire more people to do outreach, imagine how many we can reach that way. We also always consider language access, so we've been able to translate materials into different languages, often the most widely spoken languages in Massachusetts, like Spanish, Portuguese, Vietnamese, the kind of the most widely spoken languages. So more funding always allows us to expand the current work that organizations and offices around the state are already doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mejia, you have the floor.
And I just want to thank you all. This is what it looks like. The people who are doing the work, right? Informing the decisions of what we should be fighting for. So I'm glad to be here and grateful for each of you. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about, I know we talked about race, but I'm curious about some of the, and I'm sorry if I missed these questions, if some my colleagues had asked, but around language access, like folks, some of your testers and your ability, like I know sometimes it's race, but I'm just curious, but what it looks like for non-English speakers in terms of discrimination. Can you talk to us a little bit about any data that exists around that?
Sure. So while our study, or the studies that I've referenced, were really focused on race, and we ended up choosing Black testers because we wanted to control, we didn't want to have more than one variable, so that's why we chose one race to be the focus. But I will say when it comes to language access, what we see usually when it comes to language, we slot it into the national origin protected class. The idea being we send out a tester who has a audibly non-American accent. And unfortunately, what we find oftentimes is similar. They're ghosted. They're not given the same information as someone who sounds American, so to speak. So that is something, unfortunately, we see in testing. We do have testers who have non-American accents or who are not American, who immigrated here. And we're able to use those testers to perform that specific type of testing that we usually call race or national origin testing. Sometimes we categorize it as both. So unfortunately, we do see discrimination against folks that English is their second language.
Okay, thank you for that. And then I'm also curious if you could just talk a little bit about some of these usual suspects, if they so exist. Like there are some folks who have multiple triple deckers in the city of Boston. Do you have any information about some of these folks who are repeat offenders, if you will?
I mean, I certainly couldn't name and shame
No,
them.
don't shame them publicly, but I'm just curious. I guess what I'm trying to get at, I think, let me just be really specific of what I'm trying to get at, is like, when you know better, you do better.
Oh, sure.
And if there is a way for us to have some sort of inkling of knowing who potentially are these folks that may potentially need a little bit of training or a little bit of scaring or whatever that looks like. But is there a way for us to like support, to help educate folks and to be able to do follow-up, and like what does that look like on the back end?
Well, I will say sometimes when it comes to the litigation aspect of housing discrimination claims, sometimes it will be a term of the settlement that the settlement will be private, and therefore it will never become public who had a claim filed against them. So that might be something to consider. Is that something that we want to continue doing in certain cases, or is that something that allows people to kind of hide their potentially bad actions? Yeah. So that's an issue, I think, sometimes where the settlement, like they agree to settle, but privately or secretly.
And the reason why I wanted to bring it up in a public hearing, my time is up? I didn't hear that.
Yeah, time's up.
Okay.
You got 2 questions in your time.
Oh,
you
that's
did very well. You got a second question in before your bell went off. So
Okay, sorry. Every hearing is different.
Thank you. I'm trying to keep everything moving, so thank you. Good questions. Next up, Councillor Flynn. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the panel for the important work you're doing. Director Terrell, good to be with you. Director, how many staff do you have on your team?
At present, there are 9 of us, and we have 1 last vacancy to fill.
What is the breakdown in terms of language that is spoken there?
There are 4 members of our staff that are bilingual. So about half of our staff is bilingual.
What language do they speak?
Spanish.
Any speak Cantonese or Mandarin?
Not to my knowledge, no.
If a Cantonese-speaking resident wanted to work with your team, how would they go about doing that if there's a discrimination complaint that they want to file?
We would call our friends in cabinet who handle language access, and they would send us a person up to do translation, which we've done on a couple of occasions.
That's happened before?
Yes, both on the phone or on a Zoom call or in person.
I know there are some technical challenges when it is done over the phone or over the Zoom. I guess my only point is I would like to advocate for at least 1 Cantonese-speaking person on your staff, especially going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Murphy, you have the floor.
Fair. Thank you, everyone, for your, I guess I would say, sombering information that we are aware of, but it's always good to hear again. I reached out to the mayor's office a couple times. Someone had a voucher. It was touched upon a little. They expire. One issue was a specific issue where they found an apartment and it was a $10 difference between the voucher amount, and the landlord was willing to go down to cover it, but because there's so much paperwork, they lost that apartment in the, the time that was being spent trying to adjust the voucher amount. And I guess what I'm getting at, it reminds me of the low percentage, right? Less than 2% of minorities and women who fill out these bids for work across the city, because you find out it's like 27, and I'm not exaggerating, pages of documents you have to fill out. So have you thought about, or are you already starting to kind of streamline the paperwork in the mayor's office of housing, but also having advocates help fill out all that paperwork? You probably do, but knowing that on both sides too. Often also have heard from landlords that the amount of paperwork they have to fill out to even take on a Section 8 voucher is a lot, right? So on both sides, is that something that you're already doing, or we can do a better job at?
Perhaps I can speak to that one. Yeah, so we definitely recognize that the paperwork is a significant challenge. A lot of, we're quite regulated by the federal government, so we have a lot of things that we have to ask. But as I mentioned, one of the things we've been working on in the last few years is moving all of our systems online to make all of that processing much faster. We also have a customer service team that can handle pretty much any question as it comes up. And so we have made, I think, great strides. There are some things that we just have to do, unfortunately, and it is going to be a little bit slower, I think, than just renting in the private market, given who we're accountable to. But we're happy to continue to work to improve those processes and welcome any ideas and working with you to do that. So thanks for the comment.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Murphy. Councillor Worrell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panel for being here. And kind of on the similar lines, Nick, are you guys 16,000 voucher holders? How many inspectors do you have? One of the other challenges is we constantly hear from landlords and residents that the inspection can be put off for weeks, and sometimes that could be, the reason why tenants are losing apartments.
Yeah, sorry, Councilor Worrell, thanks so much. I don't have the exact number on hand. I can certainly get back to you. My understanding is we do have a very robust inspections team, and we are quite nimble to get out there. But we certainly could always use more funding, I think, to increase our inspections team and make sure that we can be there, same day, next day, to do those inspections. So I can get back to you on that exact number, but it's certainly something we would love more support in terms of increasing our staff.
Awesome. And then just taking a look online on the budget for the Fair Housing Department, and it did go down from fiscal year 23, and I'm sure that you've advocated for an increase in this year's budget to make sure that we're getting the resources to you. But just kind of, I know BHA has a AFFH department. You have Fair Housing Equity, the commission, and I know BPDA, they have an application. Like, how does the coordination and collaboration all work together?
Specifically on the assessment of fair housing, we being the commission and the monitoring committee, meet with 6 other city agencies every 90 days. Our next meeting is April 29th. We ask them to get their updated reports to us 2 weeks in advance so we can review it and prepare questions for them. So far, the process, I think, has worked pretty well. They've only had about 8 or 9 months to work on this, so we know that the first report will not be as robust as the second one a year and a half from now, because they would have had more time to delve into the issues. In particular, the BPDA is going through a major change, which I know every member of this council is very much aware of, given the debates on the planning department. So we know that in the transition from the BPDA to the planning department and some of the functions going from BPDA to the Mayor's Office of Housing, that's going to slow down their process for a while. But so far, so good. I think folks have been very cooperative, and we're looking forward just to continuing the work.
Thank you. Okay, I'll give myself 2 minutes. One thing that we ask for in new developments are, we're trying to get our 17% inclusionary development policy, IDP. We're getting that in Alston Brighton. But the other thing is to try and get those 3% of voucher preference units to get us up to 20% of income restricted. Have you folks been, I know we get a little bit of pushback from developers, but this is reliable money. Like, what's your problem? Can anyone speak to how we're addressing that, and how are we educating developers and landlords about the voucher preference program? Or if it's something, you can go for it.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's a bit of a different part of the shop than what I work on, but I'm happy to come back, get back with some answers on that, on what we've been hearing from developers.
The other thing you mentioned was bureaucratic inefficiencies. I know, just speaking to Councillor Worrell's question, inspections take time. We have an issue with folks contacting us because they're in danger of losing their apartment because their recertification process isn't moving along, or they didn't even know they had to recertify. Can you speak to the bureaucratic inefficiencies that might be obstacles that we need to smooth out as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, BHA has an incredible number of staff that work very, very hard to move as quickly as possible. One thing that we've really started to do is try to centralize everything at BHA in one place. A lot of the questions that tenants and landlords ask are very routine. Previously, we kind of had those answered in a lot of different places, and now, as I mentioned, we can answer everything internally. We've implemented a ticketing system that makes us kind of state-of-the-art, like a regular corporation, in terms of answers to questions. You can try it, you can submit something, and we'll create a ticket for you. So, there's a lot more work to do, I think, but we have, made great strides. And I just wanted to say, Councillor Worrell, to your question, we have 14 inspectors right now, but we could definitely, as I said, use more. So welcome any feedback, though, and we definitely are continuing to improve it. Really do want to make it a really amazing experience for landlords and tenants. It should not be the reason that landlords don't want to participate in the program, and we're willing to do anything we can to make that happen.
Very good, thank you. And we'll take a refocus and just swing over to any public testimony. I know that Ms. Ashley Grant, who is from the Director of Fair Housing Enforcement and Housing Discrimination Testing Program, is going to testify remotely. So if she or anyone else is available, and then anyone in the hall. Ashley, here we go. Good morning, Ashley. Welcome. You have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the council for organizing this. Such an important hearing on this topic. My name is Ashley Grant, and I'm the Director of Fair Housing Enforcement with the Housing Discrimination Testing Program at Suffolk Law School. The Housing Discrimination Testing Program, together with the Accelerator Practice Clinic at Suffolk, receives complaints from victims of housing discrimination all over the greater Boston area. Through our testing program, we're able to obtain evidence, additional evidence to support individuals' claims of discrimination. And we've done that for the City of Boston, for MCAD, for HUD, and for our own clients. We can then provide free legal representation to victims of housing discrimination. And we bring those cases before the MCAD, before the Commission, in Housing Court, and in Superior Court. You had the opportunity to hear from my colleague Kelly about what fair housing testing shows in terms of the rates of discrimination against voucher holders in Boston. And you heard from Ms. Haywood at the beginning of this hearing, who so powerfully illustrated how this discrimination impacted her family's life. I want to describe a little bit more about what our clients actually face when they're attempting to rent housing apartments here using their voucher. So discrimination based on receipt of a housing subsidy accounts for the largest percentage of our cases at HDTP. And that's due in part to the way that voucher discrimination can intersect with so many other protected classes, such as race, disability, familial status. And voucher discrimination can also happen not just when an individual is initially trying to rent, but may also happen when their apartment, for example, fails a Section 8 inspection and the landlord doesn't want to make the necessary repairs. Or when an individual has a child, which triggers the voucher requirement that the landlord provide the housing authority with a lead certificate. Many families find themselves facing eviction due to their landlord's refusal to comply with the program requirements of their voucher. Of course, as Kelly described, voucher discrimination most frequently happens when an individual is trying to find an apartment. So when someone receives a voucher, they generally have between 60 and 120 days to use it before it expires. We are constantly contacted by individuals who are at immediate risk of losing their voucher because they can't find a place within the time before their voucher expires. And as Kelly explained, just to view 10 apartments, a voucher holder has to contact about 50 units. That's not even accounting for additional factors that might affect someone's search, like having a disability or having a young child. So our clients often describe feeling hopeless, worried that they're never going to be able to find a place that will take their voucher. One of our recent clients was the mother of an adult son with a severe disability who was being evicted because the building was being sold. And after dozens of times of being ghosted and multiple instances of voucher discrimination, including being blatantly told that the landlord wouldn't accept Section 8, the client's voucher expired and she still had nowhere to live and was being evicted. Her request for more time from the housing authority was denied. Luckily, we were able to appeal that decision and compile the client's search records to show the housing authority that the client had contacted 80 apartments as part of her diligent housing search. So she got her voucher back and we were able to file a complaint on her behalf at the Mass Commission Against Discrimination. And after a year of searching, she finally found an accessible apartment to use with her voucher. So our intervention is often crucial in preventing voucher holders from losing their voucher when they're unable to find one. Once we file a discrimination complaint on behalf of a client, it can stop the clock on the voucher search time to prevent them from losing their voucher. And we can also assist tenants with disabilities in obtaining reasonable accommodations to extend their voucher search time when their disability has interfered with their ability to find housing. Our enforcement also helps prevent future housing discrimination by letting landlords know discrimination will no longer be tolerated and there are consequences. Just in the past year, HDTP and the Accelerator Practice Clinic have obtained over $70,000 in damages for victims of discrimination. As part of those settlements, we also obtain relief in the public interest, requiring housing providers and real estate agents to undergo trainings, change their policies, and engage in affirmative advertising to welcome voucher holders in the future. That happened in a case that just settled last month that we did jointly with the Attorney General's office in Superior Court, where the landlord agreed to pay $25,000 to our client who was denied because of their voucher, and agreed to attend a fair housing training and develop new anti-discrimination and fair housing policies to be approved by the AG's office. We've also gotten relief in other cases that will help protect future voucher holders, such as requiring that a property management company stop charging voucher holders a holding deposit before their application is approved. This is another really common unlawful tactic used by property managers that has a profound effect on individuals using a housing subsidy, who may be required to pay more for a holding deposit than they would be required to pay for a first month's rent using their voucher. When they don't have the ability to pay the deposit, they're simply unable to access that unit, even though a holding deposit is illegal under Massachusetts law. HDTP has significant experience in this work, and we're deeply committed to preventing housing discrimination against voucher holders in Boston and the surrounding areas. We're thrilled that the city is committed to addressing this issue, and we really look forward to working together with the city and with all of the folks here committed to this to ensure that voucher holders have equal access to housing in the city of Boston. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Grant, and thank you for all the great work you do. Councillor Durkin, you missed your opportunity to ask some questions, but I'll give you the floor now. You have the floor, 2 minutes. And
thank you so much. And my team has been reviewing the hearing, so thank you so much. I know that there was a list that you read from the BHA of things that you'd like to see different in terms of like credit checks and other things. What can we as a city council do to make sure that we're promoting what the BHA's recommendations are?
Yeah, so I think the two things I pointed out were really funding enforcement. So things that Bob has talked about and others here, and Suffolk enforcement is key. Unless we make it realistic that landlords and brokers will be caught, they're not going to change. I think education is critical, but we need to make the cost of doing that too high. So funding enforcement is key. And then the other recommendation is really banning broker fees, as I mentioned. I know that requires action at the state level, but I think the city can really advocate strongly for that. If you go to other cities in the United States, they don't have brokers fees. This is a really bizarre feature of the Boston rental market. And if you're a broker, you are severely disincentivized to work with voucher holders because our families cannot afford broker fees. I mean, most families can barely afford them, let alone low-income families. So those are the two things that BHA would recommend.
Well, and just following up on that, New York did their best to try to ban brokers' fees, and obviously it got caught up in court, and I haven't gotten an update on whether that was seen as, you know, constitutional or they had that power. But I'm just curious. I do think we have a real role to play in the conversation, and potentially even a home rule petition to that effect. In very specific housing markets in Boston, brokers are the only way to live in certain neighborhoods. I think of my neighborhood of Beacon Hill. Unless you're, you know, working unless you're already, you know, looking for an affordable unit that is designated as an IDP unit, you essentially have to pay a broker's fee. There's no other way to live in the neighborhood. It's like over 50% of the housing stock. And oftentimes when you're paying that broker fee, you found the apartment yourself. No one has done any work for you. And that's the experience of many young professionals who are trying to live and work and make it in this city. And so I think on multiple angles, it's not just, you know, for voucher holders, but on multiple angles, I think that would be a really positive step. And I thank you so much for advocating for it. Thank you.
thank you, Councillor Durkin. So can we just check, are there anyone here for public testimony? Councillor Mejia, you're the runner today. Thank you. Anyone signed up? Is there anyone in the chamber who has signed up for public testimony? Would you like to come up to the microphone and?
How much time do I have? It's like 5 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. All right.
Hold
hi.
on a sec till we get your microphone working.
All right. Was it all good? Okay. Hi, my name is Kieran Hins. I'm a housing counselor. I work with very low-income folks. So I just want to start off by stating I think the real problem is with landlords. I think we should ban brokers' fees or entirely put it on the shoulders of the landlords if we can't find a way to ban them. But you know, as a housing counselor, I'm often working with people who have vouchers, and one of the things that I find most frustrating is just the lack of clear information from BHA, like particularly from like finding information online, getting information from leasing officers. I had very recently a client who received a federal voucher. Her whole family they're not made of United States citizens, and so she did not understand why she was unable to utilize the voucher in the way that most American citizens would, which is, they pay 30% of their income toward the rent, and then BHA covers the rest. And it's just been so difficult trying to get someone to explain anything to this person, to any of my clients. It's very frustrating. It's also takes a lot of time to do anything. There's no clear timeline on these things. I recently had another client who lost an apartment because the financial documents just weren't being processed fast enough, and the landlord decided, why should I wait when I can get someone else in faster? I just find a lot of frustrations when working with BHA, and I'm sure a lot of it just comes down to lack of funding, perhaps lack of training for their various employees, and also just, I do think most of this is the fault of the landlords, but I can directly talk about experiences with BHA, so thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Danielle? Danielle, you have the floor.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, councilors, and thank you for holding this fair housing hearing and for taking this issue so seriously. My name is Danielle Summer-Kieta. I'm an affirmatively furthering fair housing consultant with the Boston Tenant Coalition, and I come here today on behalf of that organization as well as the Coalition for a Truly Affordable Boston, and as a lifelong resident of the city of Boston as well. And I just want to say, in some important ways, Boston is really leading the country in visioning and upholding fair housing. We are the first city in the country to pass affirmatively furthering fair housing, zoning rules that you heard about earlier. The AFFH rule requires the city to assess and address barriers to fair housing and take steps to promote integration and equal access to housing opportunities. And I also want to note that additionally, the recent changes to IDP, including the set aside of 3% of units held for voucher holders, are both important achievements that help Boston move forward and closer towards its goals of creating a more fair and equitable city for all. That being said, there still is a lot of work to be done to truly meet the obligations of fair housing. And I'm a consultant, I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to hold to two areas, highlighting two areas that need attention. First, when Mayor Wu signed the executive order for AFFH, there was a list of goals that accompanied that. Goal 7 was the completion of a comprehensive assessment of fair housing that would include an equity audit at the BPDA. It is the only really large outstanding goal that has not been achieved, and in fact, it actually hasn't even been started. And I would urge you to press for the assessment to be completed. We cannot truly understand the steps we need to take to proactively undo historic barriers without understanding how we created the conditions that we're in. And I would say additionally, that's really important before or during this transition as we move departments around. It makes little logical sense to do a transition and then do an assessment of how you messed up before. You'll just make more work for yourself. Secondly, I want to encourage a more proactive approach to fair housing and private development. So you heard previously how AFFH zoning came to be, and in practice that is done through an assessment tool, which is a 12-page form that lays out the way each private development will meet the mandate. So frequently, though, that assessment tool is seen as just another box or form to be ticked off and completed. It's in the appendix of every form that a developer on these large projects provides. It's often seen as a tool that's meant to be synonymous with explaining the number of IDP units in the project, and yet we know that it is much more than that. And indeed, it is really a critical vehicle by which the city of Boston strives and should be striving to meet its fair housing mandate. In order to do this more effectively, the city has to push for a more inclusive use of this rule. That would include encouraging developers to increase the number and size of family units, a more robust use of other interventions and enhancements like alternative payment schedules for first, last, and deposit, best practices around using CORI checks, and providing IDP units at a greater variety of AMI levels. And just briefly, I want to acknowledge, we've made progress in that way, and yet the average Bostonian really is very much under that 60% AMI level. In fact, a recent study showed that like a vast majority of City of Boston employees all qualify for affordable units. That's most people, and it's often misunderstood. The levels that we're talking about, it's like literally all of the teachers who work for the city. It's your flight attendants. It's the janitors. It's postal carriers. Jobs that we understand to be good middle-class jobs, they're all affordable. And what does that say about the market rate that we're doing?
Danielle.
So I'll stop it. I could talk to any of you. I'm open to meeting with anybody, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. You've made some really good points. Would you like to submit your comments in writing? We'll put them into the written
Yeah,
record
absolutely.
as well.
I will do that as well.
Thank you so much. So we'll return to questions. Councillor Louis-Jean, you have the floor.
Thank you, and I want to thank everyone. I want to thank public testimony. I think that was really insightful as well. I really do want to encourage folks to take a look at the complaint the Housing Rights Initiative and Lawyers for Rights worked on, because it shows you how blatant the discrimination is, right? That's why I'm really focusing on education, because you've got to know that or maybe they don't. Actually, that's the problem. They don't know that what they just put in writing is against the law. And we need to, that they put in writing, and we need to make that clear. And so I just wanted to elevate that. And a lot of my questions to you are to direct it to Rel, because we're talking about what's within our purview and the budget. What does a fully operational and effective Office of Fair Housing and Equity look like dollars to dollars, in terms of like how we are investing in it, what gets you to be able to do the work that works in partnership with everyone here?
There are some gaps, budget-wise and staffing-wise, that we need to seriously think about. We are the only FAP agency in New England that does not have a general counsel. When we go to fair housing conferences, and I'm leaving for one tomorrow, and we talk to our peers from around the country, they're amazed that we do the amount and level of work that we do without in-house counsel. That would be extremely helpful to us. I'm making arrangements to bring on staff, hopefully 2 sort of new positions. It's a little technical the way that HR thinks about positions that haven't been used for a while. For an intake specialist and for a director of testing. We're about to bring on a consultant to help us structure what our complaint-driven testing program will look like, but eventually I'll need a director of testing to oversee, train, recruit, deploy the testers we'll eventually bring into the program. Structurally, that's how it would work. One of the recommendations when the budget office asked us to come up with scenarios, one of the scenarios we suggested to the city was, in fact, to take all the staff that is involved in investigatory work and put it on the city budget. Dollar for dollar, that would cost the city $386,000. If that were to occur through some magical process, if that were to occur, then the positions that money used to be spent on, those dollars would be freed up. And in fact, I could use the remaining dollars to expand my staff. And you ask, well, what would I do with those funds that are freed up? I would hire at least 2 more investigators, and I would specifically assign them to go after discrimination in sales, brokerage, appraisals. Everyone talks about the need to expand homeownership opportunities for people. Well, we've got to do something about the redlining that's going on in the city of Boston. That is one of the major causes that prevents that from taking place. So, to answer your question, what a robust commission would look like, that's what it would look like.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, do I have a moment, 30 seconds? Yes, that's a yes. Okay.
And a soft.
I'll just
30
say
seconds.
thank you, Bob, for that. I just wanted to elevate your comments, Nick, on broker's fees. I think even previous mayors, Mayor Marty Walsh looked at it, what it would look like to abolish broker's fees, and I know that there's interest for us to really look at what that looks like as a barrier, right? Well, these upfront costs that are barriers to people in our city. So I want to thank you for elevating that. You know what? You can come back to me, and I have another question. But
We'll
it's
come
longer.
back.
It's
You
longer.
know the way I run this. So, Councillor Santana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question, so the Federal Fair Housing Act protects against discrimination for some characteristics, and so there are some federal programs to prevent, catch, and enforce against those particular forms of discrimination. But income source discrimination is not federally protected. It's only protected under city and state law. So we have to ensure we protect against voucher discriminations ourselves. Given that, what are the gaps in federal programs that we have to make up for locally for income source discrimination in particular, and specifically for members of the administration? Following up on President Lujan's question, how much investment would it take to substantially end voucher discrimination in Boston, or at least make it uncommon instead of rampant? How many people do we need to hire, and are there facilities or equipment we need in addition to people? What specifically should the City Council advocate for in this upcoming budget? Thank you.
Who would like to take that
I know
one?
there was a lot, so try to put it into the 2-minute.
I can go ahead. I will, again, advocate for more testing, and I know I'm harping on it, but the reason I do is that when it comes to this type of discrimination, yes, often voucher holders face blatant discrimination where someone just straight out says something. Of course, it is most straightforward when someone in writing says, I'm not going to take you because you have a voucher, and that does happen, and that creates a more straightforward case. But often, it is statements, but then the person who has been discriminated against might feel, well, they're just going to say they didn't say that. They're just going to say that they never talked to me, that I'm lying, and I think that's a valid concern to have. So where testing can come in is that it allows us, again, to do that investigation to show if there's a pattern. Often we test housing providers more than once. So we remove the idea that it might be a fluke or an accident by testing someone 2, 3, 4 times, and we can say, we sent out testers 3 different times, and you turned away our voucher tester all 3 times. And that becomes very strong evidence. We are currently, HGTP is one of the 4 housing FIPS who is currently being funded by, forgive me, they changed the acronym, formerly DHCD. HLC, yes. We did receive funding to do, we're currently doing a testing project just related to voucher holders right now as we speak. So all 4 of the FIPS are doing a concerted effort to focus on this specific issue, and it's something where more funding will always create more opportunities. Testing is very time intensive. It's the type of thing that can be done on a part-time basis, but ideally, the preference is to have someone who is full-time, a test coordinator, so they can do 50 plus tests a year, as one person. So that's, what we'd always advocate for.
Thank you. Next, Councillor Weber, you have the floor. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I agree with Councillor Louis-Jean, Madam President, in that I think it's not always the best idea to try to educate the other side, so to key them in on how they can evade, they use that to figure out how to evade the law. But here it's obviously where we have landlords who don't understand what the law says, and so I think there's a lot of room here for help in terms of education. My question is for Attorney Love, actually. Just in your lawsuit, something I thought was interesting is also against brokers. I'm not asking specifically about the facts of the lawsuit, but how does that work? What does the law say about what a broker's responsibility is in these kinds of situations?
Yes, the law is worded very broadly. Basically, it says that any person who discriminates against voucher holders in the provision of housing is committing a legal violation. And so the law encompasses anyone who is seeking tenants for a rental listing, for example. But that often manifests itself mostly in brokers doing the discriminating, because in most cases the landlords are not the ones communicating directly with the voucher holders. It's the brokers who are posting the listings on the websites or communicating with the prospective tenants via text, on the phone, et cetera. So they're the ones who are interacting directly with the people who are seeking the housing, so oftentimes they're the ones who need to know the law better than the landlords do.
And do you find, do you find that that's anyone, I guess, can answer, that the brokers don't know what the law is?
I'm hesitant to say that they don't know what the law is. I think they know very well what the law is. It's pretty simple. You can't discriminate against voucher holders. Anyone who's been in the business for any real amount of time knows that they can't do it. And so, yeah, it's a rampant problem, not just among landlords. I think people tend to assume it's the landlords who are doing the discriminating, but because they don't interact with the tenants very often, it's most of the brokers.
Is it a defense for a broker to say, well, my client said to do this?
No.
Okay. Absolutely not.
Anyone now watching at home, it was a uniform head shaking from the panel. Okay.
Thank you. We'll keep coming. We'll keep going, and if we need to come back again. Let's see. Councillor Durkin.
Thank you so much, Chair. I wanted to dig a little more into the credit check component of what we're talking about. I have been, as a district councilor, I often have like an elevated role in development conversations, just, talking with developers through the Article 80 process and being part of meetings. What can we, how can we, before a building is built, ensure that this is at the center of the conversation? And how can we make sure that, that a future building will do things in the right way, and how can we potentially get that incorporated into cooperation agreements and basically ensuring that developers and future landlords will be open to waiving this? Because I've been having conversations with even affordable housing developers, and a lot of them are still asking for credit checks, and have been a little floored when I ask about, like, would you consider waiving that? So just curious sort of your perspectives and like what are our role as a city council? What can we do as city councilors to ensure that we're doing the best thing?
Who wants to take that one?
I can say from BHA's perspective, I think it's BHA, credit scores are a lot less relevant for voucher holders in these developments because, again, their rent is backed by the federal government. So the credit score isn't really a relevant metric. So I think that's important to foreground. Also, we could work together to provide history of rent payments. There's a big move to show if you paid rent, that's actually a more on time. That's a more effective measure of your ability to keep paying rent going forward. And so I know there's a movement towards that in general around the country, but we'd be happy to work potentially together to just show that tenants can pay the rent, which is really the metric that matters most, not a credit score.
I think what I'm really concerned about is it feels like we have a lot of these conversations in silo, and we all agree that this is not something that should continue to happen. But when I am talking to people who literally develop affordable housing, they are kind of like, oh, let's talk, And I think that, like, just putting that out there, I think we need to have a serious conversation, and we need to make serious recommendations coming out of the city council, coming out of city government, to say this is what we expect of people who are going to develop things with subsidy in our city. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Durkin. Councillor Mejia, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I want to pick back up where I left off, because I always say you don't know what you don't know. You can only do better when you know better, allegedly, right? And so I really do appreciate my colleagues underscoring the importance of education. And I think that the more we know, right, in terms of what your work is, the more that we can inform our constituents. So I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. I'm just curious if there's three things that I want to ask here. One is if you happen to also collect data of the perpetrators who are like what their race and gender, maybe, because I think that, well, less gender, more race. I'm curious about the folks who are doing the discriminating, what that looks like, and I'm just curious if that exists, and if so, would love to hear it. And then the other question that I have, and this is for BHA, and we've been dealing with a lot of constituents who are having a hard time with first, last month, and security. There's a constituent right now who is trying to move into a place but doesn't have the money for first, last, and security. And I was under the impression, and maybe you might correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, that BHA helps provide some subsidies for folks who are moving in, and provide them some financial support so that they can do that. If you do, great, and if you don't, would love to hear that too. And then the other question is, in terms of maintenance, I think that there is some discrepancies and some discrimination that happens for some folks in terms of the ability to maintain folks who are already in housing. One thing is to get the housing, but then the other is kind of like any discrimination that you can point to in terms of like the upkeep of certain spaces and places that people are living in. Not to call them slumlords, but I will say that there are some folks who have taken in Section 8 voucher holders and have completely disregarded them and their living conditions, and I'm curious if you have any data around that.
Who would like to take that one? Mr. Terrell.
With regard to the race of respondents, we can run a report for you, and we can tell you their racial, a little bit about their racial background. We can tell you what part of the city we're seeing discrimination occur. I think your question was focused pretty much on Section 8 voucher holders. Again, we don't get a lot of those cases as of yet, but at least in general, in terms of the complaints we do see at the commission, we could run a report for you and try to identify that. It's buried in our database somewhere. We can try to figure it out. Also, to Councilor Weber's earlier question, which I don't think I answered completely, we can run a report and give you those numbers.
Yeah, and in that report, it would also be helpful to know how many of those who are discriminating against the people in Boston, how many of them actually live in Boston. And I know that there's some information that you can't share just based on protected classified information, I understand that. But I think that I'm the type of person that the more I know, the fuller the picture is, and I know kind of where some viable solutions may be in terms of how we can get ahead of this. So I'm also curious about the people who are discriminating, whether or not they even live in Boston.
Well, just so you'll know, Counselor, once a case is resolved and finished, most of the information in that case file is public record.
Including the person who did it?
Correct.
So then that's a little bit contradicting to the question that I asked earlier, because it seemed like it wasn't public, so now I'm confused.
So I think I was speaking to other forms of litigation. My understanding is it's not the City of Boston's policy to keep cases private, is that right? Generally in settlements?
Right, once the case is closed. Now, if the case is ongoing and under investigation, we can't share it.
Right.
We get those kind of requests quite often. We said, as long as it's being adjudicated, we can't share the information. But once the case is closed and resolved, then it's public record.
And I'm getting nervous because I know I'm going to get the gravel here,
Yeah.
but I wait for my second round or third round because I'm thinking about the Boston Jobs residency, very similar to kind of what you're doing here. And there is definitely a list of bad actors, and I know you can't publicize and shame people to act right, but I think that if that is a lever that we can pull, then I think people will be a little bit more mindful of how they're showing up for folks. So I just want to name that for the record. I'll wait for my turn to come back.
Right. I don't know if I'm going to get into a can of worms here, but you mentioned disposition of civil penalties. Would you like to, you threw that out there and you said, oh, maybe I shouldn't go there, but can you let us know what are the shortcomings in disposition of civil penalties, or obstacles to executing the penalties?
Under our ordinance, we're empowered to impose a civil penalty. The theory behind the civil penalty is if a person of a particular protected class has been injured, there's potential for other people in the city of Boston who are members of the same protected class to also be injured. So think of the civil penalty as, in a way, a fine that the city of Boston is imposing because you broke our civil rights law, our ordinance. And we have a graded system where if you are a respondent and you're found guilty, but speaks to the issue of repeat offenders. If you come back and you're found guilty again within a certain time frame, we can raise that civil penalty to a certain level. And say within 5 years, if you come back 3 times, it goes up again, and then it hits an upper limit. In the amendments we're going to be suggesting to council, we want to reframe and maybe even make that system even simpler to utilize. We can impose the civil penalty. The question is, where does the money go?
That's a good question.
A very good question. And at one point I said to my commissioners, my first month on the job, I said, I noticed the last couple of orders that have gone out, we're not imposing civil penalties. Why? We have the authority to do so. And they said, well, we didn't think it was appropriate in that particular case. I said, well, I think we need to start imposing civil penalties. This gets to some of the enforcement issues. This gets to how to get people to obey the law when they know what the law is and they're pretending not to know. Providing them a little encouragement to obey our fair housing laws. So one of the questions would be, where does it go? Now, obviously I have a biased response to that. I think it should go to the Fair Housing Commission. Well, we did the work, we should then apply that money to fair housing activities. But as it is now, I think it would go directly to the Treasury Department.
Seems like it's worthy of further conversation.
Thank you.
Councillor, I'm going to try and make this your last question. So, Councillor Santana.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. For income source discrimination in particular, I've wondered if more education for housing providers might be part of the solution. But it's my understanding that something like 92% of test subjects who experience housing voucher discrimination in a Suffolk law study interacted with brokers who received training and should know they're violating the law. And we certainly saw evidence of voucher discrimination by trained real estate professionals who should know better in the HRI and LCR lawsuit too. For whoever on the panel who would like to speak on it, do you have thoughts on additional educational programs we should put in place for housing providers that data has proven effective locally or elsewhere? Or have we mostly done what we need to do for key investments in housing provider education and its renter education that might need more investment now?
So we have advocated for changes to the licensure structure for brokers. In our study, the vast majority of our testers interacted with brokers, even though we randomly selected apartments. So, as it was mentioned a little before, it is the case that often the landlords are removed from the process to the point where it is the brokers that are doing discriminatory things, whether it be on their own behalf or on behalf of the housing provider, the landlord. So we advocate for changes that require fair housing training. So believe it or not, licensed brokers in Massachusetts are actually not required to do specifically fair housing training. They have a certain set of hours that they have to complete to become licensed, but it does not specify currently this amount of fair housing training. So we have advocated for changes to that structure to provide mandatory fair housing training, and also for that training to be refreshed. So some kind of requirement for brokers to have to become recertified in fair housing. I personally do train real estate professionals in my day-to-day work. Sometimes the professionals ask us to train them. For example, I did a training recently for the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. So I love that, there are organizations proactively trying to train themselves. But I think where the city and the state can come in is changing those requirements to make them more strict so that the training is guaranteed to be happening.
Thank you. Councillor Louis-Jean, do you have a final question?
No, I just did want to, another thing that I wanted to highlight is that we had a constituent who came to our office who wasn't feeling heard or seen by issues of discrimination that she had experienced in where she was living in affordable housing development here in the city of Boston. And she had just kept on hitting brick walls. And she then contacted the Office of Fair Housing and Equity. And you all engaged with her and you talked to her and you created a report. Even though the report wasn't enough to be able to get her to validate her claim, I think there was a lot of value for this constituent in feeling like the government, heard and listened to her, and she feels validated. So I just wanted to publicly thank you and your office for that work, because I think it's important, right? Like part of the work of government, even when we can't solve or completely put a bow on an issue for a constituent, at least showing up and knowing that we're here as an entity is important, which is why I've been stressing education. And the budget just came out, and so we will be doing our due diligence to make sure that we are funding what we care about. And like you said, given the turnout that you saw here, that will help us to fully advocate for support for the office. And I just want to, again, thank everyone for the work that you do. I really hope that we're able to do the partnerships that we talked about, that we're able to have investigators dedicated to looking at lending and appraisals. And I just want to thank everyone for your work. I think that Ms. Albert, the work that you were talking about that you're doing, for our public housing residents, it's the same that when I was talking to Bob. Like, so many people feel unseen and not supported because of their income levels, because they're Black. Something we didn't talk a lot about is family discrimination. So if there's a question here, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that looks like. The way that you see family discrimination, is that when it comes, do you see that with vouchers? Is that when you see it most prevalent? I'd love to hear a little bit about that. But I just want to thank all of you for the work that you do, and happy Fair Housing Month.
Thank you. Excellent. Anyone, do you want a response to the
if anybody wants
anyone
to.
want to speak to the fan? That was one of my concerns as well. So let me just stop this thing. It's ringing.
The problem of family discrimination. So, Nick can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that's not really a problem in the voucher system. I think the vast majority of people who have housing choice vouchers are families with children. But the family discrimination really manifests itself in two different ways in Massachusetts. First, a lot of towns surrounding Boston especially restricts their subsidized housing to, it's age restricted. So the only subsidized housing available in the town at all is for people over the age of 70, which prevents families with children from being able to get subsidized housing. And the second way
And
that
what kind of towns do this? Where do they do this? Where the only affordable housing is for seniors?
There are suburbs.
Suburbs around Boston. Yeah, it's extremely prevalent. So it's obviously this body is not something that can solve that problem, but just to answer your question. And then the second form is there are a lot of zoning restrictions on bedroom sizes, for example, so that prevent developers from building apartments that have more than 2 bedrooms or more than 3 bedrooms. And so families with children often need bigger apartments with more rooms. Families that live intergenerationally need bigger apartments with more rooms. So restrictions on bedroom sizes, and then also restrictions on parking. So if you require developers to have a certain number of parking spaces per bedroom, that prevents them from building units with more bedrooms, because then they have to create more parking, which costs more money. So those are the 3 most obvious ways that you see discrimination against families with children. But unfortunately, the Fair Housing Act, although families with children have been a protected class for a long time, there's just not a lot of litigation to enforce the FHA, and so those kinds of restrictions are really prevalent.
Thank you. Councillor Weber, This is your last round up here, so you make a statement, ask a question, or both.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think the broker training, it seems like like the missing link maybe in this, to have brokers actually know the law and, be able to advise their clients not to, disobey the law. I guess if anybody has, we've heard that Boston is sort of at the forefront of this, but is there anything going on in other cities that you would like to see here?
Right to counsel, for sure, in eviction cases. New York City's been rolling that out for a few years. It's been a little...
I did not plant this.
It's taken a long time, and it was rolled out slowly in various zip codes, but it's really, really important. Landlords almost always have counsel, and tenants almost never have counsel because they can't afford it.
Please make clear that we've never met before this meeting, and we've not spoken. I guess, yeah, I agree with you. It's a great suggestion. But yeah, anything else in terms of just the voucher discrimination? Or no? Okay. Well, I don't know. Ms. Demetrius, is anything else that you'd like to see here in Boston?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to raise this up. I think there are a lot of things looking at that other cities and towns, other states are looking at, particularly around appraisal testing. So I'll uplift the need to really put funding, because it's going to take a lot of infrastructure to be able to build out a testing program for appraisal discrimination. And so as much as you do a campaign around education and outreach around these issues, which I think helps when you uplift the stories of people who have been made whole in some ways, you definitely have to be primed and ready to be able to respond, to do things like testing. And one of the things we're working with at CHAPA is, as we think about the brokers and training them, also thinking about the future landlords. So incorporating fair housing into the first-time homebuyers classes from a framework of not only how to not violate the law, because you may become a landlord, as a potential homeowner is also a potential landlord, and also potentially faces other issues even after being housed, right, around appraisal discrimination. So how to incorporate that into first-time homebuyer pieces of the training is one of the things we're working on with CHAPA, with some of our partners.
Thank you.
Councillor Mejia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you all for being here. I've worked with you in different ways and capacities, and I'm really excited to continue to champion those issues here on the council, so thank you for your work. I just wanted to uplift that I always say that Boston is resource rich but coordination poor, and this conversation really just reminds me of how many opportunities we have to educate the public, whether it be through the Boston Public Health Commission, our community health centers. They could also be educating our constituents about what does this look like, how can, when you know you've been discriminated, what actions to take, right? So I think that education is key, and I think we need to start tapping into every single little budget item here in the city of Boston, because everyone touches this conversation one way or another, right? So Bob, don't worry, we're not gonna take it from one, we're gonna take it from all of them. No. But I think that this conversation really, we need to think outside the box, right? We just get so caught up in government just to one size fits all, and we need to just start evolving and to really think about all of the different ways that we can help support this work and all of the different departments that touch this conversation. So I'd love to continue to dive deeper to see what that looks like. And then the other piece that I want to uplift is this whole notion around, my mom was a Section 8 voucher holder, right? And we got really lucky. She was able to stay in one place for a long time, and so the landlord sold the triple-decker that my mom had lived in. And then when the new landlord came in, the rents were my mom could no longer afford to stay there, even as a low-wage worker. And I think that discrimination happens to folks, even people who are already housed. And I think I just want to name that as something for us to consider as part of another, it's not just trying to get in. I just also think staying in your apartments once someone new has come to own it. And I think that is, I just want to raise that as something for us to monitor. And Bob, I see you got something to say.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia. Do you want to respond? Yes. You have the floor.
There we go. Just one little known fact about the Section 8 program, which we at the Commission are paying a lot of attention to lately because of our concern about home ownership. Section 8 vouchers can be used to buy a home. Mm-hmm. It is one of the real secret aspects of the Section 8 program. You can use your voucher and the subsidies that come with it for 15 years to pay your mortgage. For some reason, that aspect of the voucher program has been underutilized. And I think we might be able to kill two birds with one stone if we, if we think about using Section 8 vouchers to create more affordable home ownership in Boston. Mm-hmm. That would be stable and long-lasting. Right. So I think we really need to investigate that more thoroughly.
Yep, and I appreciate you saying that. I think you're going to say something, but I wanted to say how important that piece is, because you don't know what you don't know. And there also have been cases in BHA, and I'm going to name it, that folks have moved on, but they haven't transferred that voucher to another family member, and that's information that other people don't know about. There's so many different ways to protect people, but we have yet to find the way and to communicate that to folks. And I think that, Bob, I really do appreciate you naming that here.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia. Did you have a comment?
Just really quick to say, thank you so much, Bob, for your comments. The BHA did launch a Section 8 to home ownership program in the last year, our First Home program, which the city has helped fund through ARPA dollars and elsewhere. We've helped over 40 families purchase homes coming out of public housing and the Section 8 program. So always looking for more support for that program. And I did just want to say, Councilor Mejia, to your previous question, we aren't able to provide, though, first and last month. We usually ask the state for help with security deposit, and they're able to help with that. And then on unit conditions, tenants can call in complaints, and 100% of complaints are inspected within a week, and if it's an emergency, within 1 day. But welcome continuing to work to improve our processes.
Thank you. All right. Last but not least, I really want to thank you all for being here. I think we've had a really robust conversation back and forth. We've raised lots of issues. We have highlighted so many hidden secrets about voucher programs and how they can be used to help with your home buying. This is a really important conversation. As the Chair of Housing, I'm committed to continue this conversation and to see how we can support your work to decrease or maybe eliminate discrimination in housing. So I thank you all for your participation, and all the folks who joined us remotely and the folks who came in person to testify. Thank you all, and happy Solar Eclipse Day, and this meeting is adjourned.